Hi, I'm Everett Doolittle. I'm, as you know, the professor of the class, and in the class on ethics, and I asked John Harrington to please come and say a few, it's a joke here, we won't talk about, to say a few words. And first, introduce yourself for those that haven't, don't know who you are.
As Everett said, my name is John Harrington. I am the Chief of Police for the Metropolitan Transit Police, which is a fairly new department, one of the faster growing departments in the 8-county metro area of the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul. I've been there for about 3 years. Prior to that, though, I started my career in law enforcement in policing with St. Paul Police Department, the capital city, and spent 33 years with St. Paul, my last 6 there as the Chief of Police. And somewhere in between those 2 jobs, I served as the Minnesota State Senator from the east side of St. Paul, Senate District 67.
You also are involved in the creation of the law enforcement program at Metro.
Yes, that was an early assignment. Tobin Barroso asked me when I was a young sergeant, having just finished my master's at St. Thomas, if I would head up the creation of the School of Law Enforcement. And I had the pleasure of picking the first facility over on Energy Park Drive, hiring the first dean, hiring Mike Breesy, who was one of the first full-time faculty, and helping actually create the curriculum that the baccalaureate in law enforcement is based on today. So that was a really fun project to be a part of. So
it was, and then now the classes ethics we're talking about, and I know you're working on your doctorate, and you were just sharing about revisiting some of the we'll call the great philosophers, and how it does fit a lot of the things towards reality.
Oh, this is a much richer topic now than it was 30 years ago in the academy when we talked about ethics, because now I have a context to put things into. Now, as I'm thinking about John Stuart Mill's and utilitarianism or consequentialism, and I'm now applying that to the discussion about what should we do as in public policy about human trafficking. How do we interact? How do we see the good of the many versus the good of the few? How does that construct work? As you look at issues around Immanuel Kant and kind of the deontological ethical systems, how do you apply that into issues around say domestic violence? Is there ever a rationale where you can come up with a moral justification for violence and threats in a family situation? Can you ever, how do you apply those moral standards to issues around, say, terrorism, and how do you interact with the community around issues around the 9/11 situation and terrorism and jihad? Those are much richer conversations these days than they were 30 years ago, when they seemed to be sort of in a vacuum of you shouldn't take a cup of coffee. I remember that seemed to be the hardest discussion in ethics back in 1977 in the academy, is whether or not I was going to take a free cup of coffee or take a half-price meal. Now I look at ethics, well, partly because I look at it from the perspective of having to make serious ethical decisions, not just occasionally, but every day. And having to make them as a sergeant, having to make them as a lieutenant, having to make them as a chief of a major department, having to make them now as the chief of a growing department. Those decisions are much richer and much tougher decisions to make about what is the right course of action for my organization, for my staff, for my community, and sometimes for myself.
You know, for most of my career, the word ethics meant don't take it, don't steal, and that was it.
Yep.
And there was no training. There was nothing in this field at all for me and most police officers I know. In fact, most of the literature said, the key is we spend no time in an academy, or we do. It's there, but it's just a tiny bit there. So is this something that is a continued learning process? I want you to picture the students. Most of the students here are law enforcement, and their goal is to be promoted. Now, I know when they talk about ethics as a street officer, but as you get promoted, you have a huge responsibility. So how do you develop an ethical organization?
Well, I think there's several facets of that, and I've been fortunate to be part of a conversation in my old department and now with some of my colleagues who have continued to get promoted. Some of the young people that I worked with are now chiefs and sheriffs and other agencies, and we still have that conversation. But part of that conversation comes to really the fundamental training and selection of the officers that are going to be in your department. What's the ethical standard for what kind of cop do you want to have is a really hot button issue right now in policing. And for those folks who are new sergeants or new command staff, it's going to be one of the challenges that you have, as there is a big push, I think rightfully so, to say we want people of the highest character. But what does that mean? What does it mean to be selecting and training people of high character? And does it mean that you're hiring people who've never done anything wrong in their lives? Because that is becoming increasingly difficult to find, number one. And I'm not sure if it's necessarily the best choice to make, even in the hiring situation. But I will tell you, one of the places that we have this very serious ethical conversation is mostly in problem-oriented policing and community-oriented policing. One of the things that I challenge my staff to bring to the table when they're making planning decisions about what are we going to do about prostitution in a bus shelter or about a gang problem up in a corner up in North Minneapolis, is to come back to me and have thought through what are the ethical implications of how we're going to approach that problem. Because I think we need to make sure that we're doing it right, because the community looks to us to say it's not enough, and this becomes the utilitarian argument, it's not enough to just say, I got rid of the problem. It's, did you get rid of the problem the right way? Because if you didn't get rid of it the right way, the community will just as likely come after you for cutting corners along the ethical continuum, as much as they're going to go back after the members of the community that were cutting corners doing bad things. So I think it's important for young supervisors and young managers to have that sense of, how do I know right from wrong? How do I know where the ethical gray areas are? And there are a huge number of ethical gray areas out there. Use of force these days, that's becoming increasingly an area where the question of, yeah, you have the right to do something, but is it the right thing to do? And those two are not the same. To decisions about when do you make an arrest, discretion was preached to me as a young beat cop, and I think ethics is a huge component in making good discretionary decisions.
So there's a lot, especially as a supervisor. Now the beat cop, you know, I'll hear Mark, well, discretion means I can do whatever I want, and it doesn't. It means
never has. So,
but you know, but this is their justification. And maybe they pull a police officer over and they'll say, well, we're not going to give him a ticket because he's a fellow officer. Well, if you're a supervisor, what would you say to young officers? Now, don't get me wrong, I don't care if they give a ticket. No. I care about the entitlement to think I can do what I want and nobody's going to hold me accountable, and putting you in the position of deciding to give it or not.
One of those easy ethical, an early easy ethical lesson I got from one of my old bosses was that they asked the question, would you be proud to tell your mom about this?
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, it's actually, you know, moms are great barometers of right and wrong for us. They're for most of us, and not to besmirch dads, but our moms were the person who I think probably fundamentally kind of guided us in terms of that. And they're the people we don't want to embarrass oftentimes is not. Would you want your mom to know that you gave a cop who was drunk, who smashed up their car, a break? How would your mom feel about that? And if your mom would look at you and give you that evil eye that moms sometimes do, it might be an indication that you're on some ethically shaky ground at that point. The other question is what message does that send from a consistency perspective to the rest of the department? If you're going to give them a break on that, then are you going to give them a break when they got drugs in their system? Are you going to give them a break when they pull a gun on somebody? Are you going to give them a break when they beat up their wife? Where's that line drawn where professional courtesy stops? And you better have an answer for that if you're a boss and you're going to countenance that kind of behavior. You better have had that kind of a conversation about what your expectations are of your officers if you're going to say, well, with a wink and a nod, that's okay.
Yeah. So in other words, again, back to the supervisor, what they do, what they don't do, really meets the message far more than their words. William Bratton, as we've talked about, he says, you know, the real secret is, again, what you went back to, is when nobody's watching. But he also said that many people do the right thing because of the fear of being caught doing it, not because they believe in the ethical, believe in it to do the right thing, but it's the fear. And the goal when we talk about ethics is to convince people, before you're ever in trouble, keep each other from doing it.
Right.
Hold people accountable. Don't let them do it. Don't lie because they did something. Stop them before they do it because you know it's wrong and have the courage to.
I'm having a conversation with a colleague of mine from another department today, and we were talking about an officer who was involved in a pretty heated use of force with a juvenile, and quite literally in this case, it was the supervisor in the control room who screams out over the thing, "You do not tase that 12-year-old boy." And that sergeant was acting in a responsible fashion. He could see that his cop had lost it and was about to do something that was going to get that officer, the sergeant, and that department in a bag of mess that they were not going to be able to extricate themselves. Mikey Quinn, I don't know if you remember Mikey. Mike was a tactical sergeant, probably the toughest guy I ever worked with. He worked decoy over in Minneapolis, but he wrote a book, Walking with the Devil, that talks about when it's appropriate as a young cop to step out of line, or as a young sergeant to step out of the line and say, that crosses a line for me, and I'm not going to let you do it because I wouldn't do it, and you're implicating me when I let you do this, because by not taking action to stop it, I'm in fact just as culpable as you are.
Yeah, and like say and Mike talks about the peer intervention.
Exactly. Yep.
You know, the answer isn't towards say, what do I do now? Do I lie for you or not? It's I stop you and stop me and develop a contract where you won't let me step over. And being past the statute of limitation, I remember as a young deputy sheriff chasing some guy clear across the county. And finally, I ran him into the ditch. I jumped out with my car, ran up to the window, and maced the heck out of him, just to realize he was unconscious from the accident. And the heart was going, the adrenaline's going, you know, and you know, you could easily, and that's really the responsibility. You talk about ethics is help each other. Don't stand back and watch somebody putting too much force. You know it's wrong. Do something, but it takes courage.
Well, it does take courage. It takes, and I remember a similar situation in St. Paul when my old chief McCutcheon, he made it a policy that every supervisor, and this was a way of him ensuring good ethical behavior, at the end of every chase, a supervisor had to go and interview the person that got chased to ask the question, how are you treated post-arrest? And if you went in there and the guy was all beat to hell, somebody needed to be held accountable, because the rules of engagement that McCutcheon and we had followed from that point on was, once you have him in custody, custody meant he's in your care. It doesn't mean that you now get a free shot because he's handcuffed. It meant he's in your care, and anyone that takes that free shot with your prisoner, you need to stop.
And again, that takes us right towards one of the main things we're talking about, called the social contract. I don't care if you like him or not. You know, once you reach the point and use force and you've completed your goal, anything beyond that's punishment, and you have no right to punish people. And if somebody else tried to, it's your obligation to protect them, even if you don't like them.
Exactly, and I think that's, you know, I tell people the term custody, really, if you think about it in terms of, you know, we turn over custody of a baby to somebody that's a proper custodial parent. We expect that that person is going to take care of that child. When you have custody of a prisoner, and this prisoner may not, certainly is, in many cases, has not been somebody you're going to want to bring home to mama, it doesn't matter. You are the person that now has that person's physical well-being in your hands, and your job is to deliver them to proper, competent authority for punishment or adjudication. That's our line gets drawn pretty clearly in the criminal justice system, at where punishment is not in our line. Use of force is to control, not to punish.
And even if they disrespect you, and it takes courage, and it's hard.
Well, it's incredibly difficult because you're emotionally charged. The adrenaline's going. You are trained to act and you want to act, and that's where being a real professional comes into play, is taking that breath and not letting your emotions overwhelm your judgment and saying the right thing to do here is to stuff him in the back of the squad car and bring him and book him, and that's the right thing to do, even when there is an overwhelming sense that what I really want to do is knock the hell out of him. But that isn't ethical policing, and the community, I think one of the things that we're seeing in this particular day and age, and the kind of what I describe from my cops as the Ferguson effect, is that we as a profession are all under the microscope, and everything we do now is going to be hyper scrutinized to see, did you follow the rules that you say you're following? And so it's important for the officers to know, and the supervisors to know, what are the rules of engagement in your organization? What are the policies in your organization? And that to be able to, as the chief of police, to go out for, step up to that microphone when something bad happened, a la Ferguson, and be able to say, we did it right, we did it wrong, and if we did it wrong, we're going to fix it. There's nothing wrong with admitting that there are occasions when you and your cops are going to do it, are going to go beyond the lines that you would have liked to see them go. But that doesn't mean you can't fix it. It just means, okay, it's not that different than the community. I expect the community to take responsibility when bad things happen with members of the community. That doesn't mean that the community is unredeemable either. So,
and again, the more I build a relationship in the community, the more I can survive when something doesn't go well.
Exactly.
And
we call it the trust bank.
Yeah.
As I've been building this new network of beat officers, part of what I've been telling my cops is, what you don't understand is that nice little lady who you gave directions to, you just made a deposit into the trust bank of that little lady, that the police officer was nice and they were respectful and they helped me. And there will come a time when we're going to make withdrawals from that trust bank. I have personally, as a chief of police and as a manager, had times when I've had to go to that community meeting where I knew the people were very unhappy about how my officers had performed. But I went in there saying, here's how we have performed for the last 20 years. I'm going to fix this. I'm going to find out what happened, and if somebody did the wrong thing, I'm going to hold them accountable. But in the meantime, I need you to give me enough time to take care of my business. And that's where that's a withdrawal from the trust bank, because if they really don't believe that there's any chance that you as a manager or a supervisor are really going to do the right thing, they have no reason why they won't, do the demonstration or write their letters to the editor or blog about how bad your police department is. But if you've been doing the right thing in that community, I really do believe that what you get is you get the benefit of the doubt. You get trust. You get, they understand that I hire human beings. And the more I hire human beings from their community, I find the more sympathetic they are. Oftentimes it's not that, yeah, that kid grew up here, and I get that he made a mistake, and I expect you to correct his behavior. And in the meantime, we also expect you to continue to do good police work in our neighborhood, because this is not an either or. I mean, you look at Ferguson, where it completely disrupted the department's ability to do anything other than deal with the demonstrations. I keep thinking every day after, while all those guys were on the line, in riot gear, who's taking the calls? Who's managing? Who's doing investigations? Because the city didn't stop existing because of, the Ferguson shooting. No.
Yeah. So what would you tell? You got a new sergeant. Because one of the things I've seen, just because you're allowed to do it, just because you can, argue, well, that's what I was told, or that's what I'm trained in, I did everything right, there's huge consequences to a lot of behavior that might be legally right. So what would you tell this gentleman, as we talked about, just got promoted, there's going to be a new supervisor, and why should he really care about ethics? Why should, what should he be telling his subordinates or his direct reports?
Well, I think it starts with you modeling good ethical behavior. I think it starts with you modeling behavior that is reflective and thoughtful about the consequences of what we do. And what we do in policing and what we do as a peace officer, we have enormous amounts of power, and because of that, the scrutiny of when we use that power is justifiably severe. You need to model good behavior. You need to be modeling for your young officers how to interact, how to make good decisions. You need to be holding them accountable when they're making questionable decisions. And I think it's important for young sergeants to ask that question of their cops. Well, why did you do that? That why question is an important question, because it will give you a glimpse into the psyche of your officers. Well, why did you choose to do that use of force, or why did you choose to make that arrest? I think that gives you a sense as to, are the officers thinking about their business? I'm not hiring robots. If I wanted them to be automatic, I could get drones to do that. That's not what I'm hiring. I'm hiring human beings who are going to make good, ethical judgments. And then finally, when you do have an officer that steps over the line, and trust me, it didn't take me but a few days as a sergeant to have a cop that did something that turned out to be not according to the way the policy worked. And as a chief of police, I've had hundreds and hundreds of IA complaints and complaints that have come across my desk. The important question then is you need to be able to articulate for yourself and for your organization, you are setting the standard. What is the value system? What system makes this right and what makes this wrong? And you have to be willing, and this is a scary moment for young supervisors, you need to be willing to stand up in front of that roll call and say, hey guys, we had a chase last night. At the end of the chase, somebody put the boots to the guy that was driving the car. Guys, I won't tolerate it. It's not okay. It's not according to policy. I know you guys are all worked up. We are going to investigate it, and if I find out who did it, we'll hold them accountable. But I want you to know, as your boss, that's not how we do business here. And that has to go from the supervisor, that's the roll call supervisor, to the lieutenant. It can't just be IE's job. It can't just be the chief's job. Good ethics in an organization starts with that first line supervisor, because frankly, as we both know, that first boss, the guy that gives you your days off, the guys that approves your trips and things along that lines, that first line supervisor is damn near God to most young cops. You're going to be the person who gets them out of trouble, and you're going to be the person that sometimes has to hold their feet to the fire. And I think that's the important part for new supervisors and for new managers too, is modeling the ethical behavior and then articulating good ethical principles for them, and then when necessary, you have to hold them accountable. And that can be real unpleasant, especially if you're a brand new supervisor. And I can remember going into roll call and having a guy that was my classmate from the academy class. We had worked squads together, and now I got stripes and he doesn't, and he had stepped over the line, and I've got to do something about it. And it was an incredibly uncomfortable feeling of, I've got to do something to somebody who I think of as a peer. But those stripes on my sleeve said we weren't peers anymore. I had a responsibility to the organization, to the community, and frankly to him, to let him know he'd stepped over the line. Because if I don't hold him accountable, he'll keep doing it.
And you'll also lose your credibility.
But you'll lose your credibility, you lose your authority, not only in the sense that you'll lose it to the cops, but you'll also lose it for the community. A community that doesn't feel like the management or the supervisor or the bosses hold people accountable when bad things happen is a city where they feel like they might as well take law into their own hands because they can't trust the administration, they can't trust their police department.
Good. Thank you. We really appreciate
Thanks.
you coming in.
Hey, always a pleasure. So it's good to see you.
Yes.
And I like the Bobby and the Sherlock Holmes piece.
So good.